G'day everyone. In my last video I showed how I built the roof racks on my Toyota Coaster bus. And that was a big job and I was so happy to tick that job off the list, and they were super solid and I thought I'd done a really good job. But it turns out that the way that I built them was totally wrong, and now I have to pull them all apart and redo the whole thing. And instead of spending today packing the bus for my big road trip, which was supposed to start tomorrow, I'm instead going to be trying to fix this mess. So if you haven't seen my last video, I'll put a link to it in the description below, and I'll keep it on my channel as an example of how not to build roof racks on your bus. The brackets that I used were steel brackets from Roof Rack World that I bought off the shelf. And I talk in detail about those brackets in my last video, so go and check them out. But to make all of the rails for the roof racks, I used aluminium RHS, and I bolted it all together using high tensile bolts with contact washers and lock nuts, and it was all super solid, and I thought I'd done a really good job, and I was so happy to get that job ticked off the list because it was the last big job that I had to do before I could hit the road on my big road trip to go and see the electrician to get the solar panels and the rest of the electrical system installed. As I said, I was so happy when I finally finished that job. I posted some pictures of my roof racks in one of the bus groups that I'm in on Facebook, and that's where it all went pear-shaped because I had a few guys tell me that you can't bolt aluminium RHS the way I'd done it, and that if you're going to be using aluminium RHS, then it really needs to be welded, or if you're going to bolt it through like I did, you need to have special crush tubes inside the RHS where all the bolts are going through. Now, you'll know if you're in any of the groups on Facebook that when you post something, you get a mix of responses. And there are always people that want to make negative comments and criticize the work that you've done or complain about something that you've posted. That's just the unfortunate nature of social media. But these guys were all experienced fabricators and aluminium welders, so they kind of knew what they were talking about. And I'd never heard of this before. I mean, I'd seen lots of pictures of people putting bolts through aluminium, and I've never heard of that being an issue. So I Googled it and discovered that yes, it's a thing. And they were actually entirely correct. If I had left my roof racks the way that I had built them, then over time all of the bolts would have come loose. It would have rattled like mad as I'm driving down the road, and worse, it could have come loose and bits flying off, which is obviously not what you want. So what happens is, the issue is with aluminium, because it's quite a soft metal, especially in a vehicle where you've got a lot of vibration and a lot of movement, over time just the force of that bolt clamping down on the aluminium is enough to just crush it a little bit. And of course, if it crushes inwards, it's going to loosen the bolt. And over time that bolt can become really loose, even if you've used lock nuts as I did. So this is a bit tricky for me to explain, but if you do a search for crush tubes in aluminium, you'll get the idea of what I'm talking about. Now, if you're wanting to put a bolt all the way through RHS like this, as I was doing, then you can't just have the bolt going through like that, because over time this aluminium will just crush inwards a little bit and that bolt will become loose. So what you need to do is actually put either a tube of metal into there and then pass the bolt through that, or you can use a stack of something like steel washers and pass the bolt through that, just so you've got something in there to help keep that aluminium apart and prevent it from crushing inwards. Now, that might be easy to do if you're on the edge of the RHS like this bolt here is, and you can physically reach and just stick something in there. But if you've got holes in the middle of a long piece like I have on my roof racks, it's impossible to just push something in there. You need to specially drill a bigger hole, insert a tube that then really needs to be welded in place. So it's a bit fiddly and kind of requires skills that I don't have to do properly. So it's not really an option for me. The way that aluminium RHS should be bolted is just to bolt through one face. So instead of passing the bolt all the way through both sides, you really need to just bolt, like if I'm bolting for instance, these two pieces together like I would be in a roof rack, then rather than the bolt going through the whole lot, you really just need to put the bolt through these two faces here so that there's nothing, you know, so the bolt is just tightening down on one piece of the aluminium, one side of the aluminium, and it's not crushing the tube inwards. Now, that's a bit tricky to do with RHS. It's a lot easier to do if you've got something like C-channel where you can easily access the middle of, you know, the channel and get to both sides from kind of the inside of the channel. And in hindsight, that's what I should have built my roof racks out of. Instead of the hollow box section, I should have used C-channel because it would have eliminated this issue. But one thing that you can do is actually do what I've done here, drill a much larger hole on the opposite side so that you can access that and put the bolt in. And then you can fit a socket in there to tighten it as you would normally, or, you know, pass the bolt through this way and you've got room in there to access to get the nut on and tighten it up with the socket. So that is one option. You can kind of see here what I mean. So I've got a bigger hole cut on the opposite side. I've passed my bolt through and the nut and everything is sitting in there. Then this bolt is just tightening. I don't know if you can see this very well, but it's just clamped down on this part of the RHS here. So it's not going to crush the whole tube with the force of the bolt clamping down. And if you can do that, then that's perfectly fine. That if you're using proper lock nuts and you've got them tightened up correctly, that shouldn't come loose, even with the movement of the bus. It's only an issue if you're trying to bolt through the whole piece. Now I could probably do that for all of the bolts in my whole roof rack system and just reuse what I've made and not have to spend any more money getting new aluminium and starting again. But the problem that I still have is that my electrician needs a way to bolt the solar panel clamps onto my roof racks. And if he bolts straight through the whole piece, he's going to have that's going to be the same issue with crushing, and that's going to come loose over time. My solar panels could come off. That's not acceptable. So I need something that he can bolt down on that's not going to have this crush issue. And so what I'm thinking is I'm going to try doing this just for the crossbars. So I've got 8 crossbars on my roof racks. And if I can successfully cut all of these holes without mucking any of them up, then I should be able to reuse all the crossbars. And then what I'll do is I'm going to get some C-channel and use that for the long rails. So I will have to remake the long rails. I'll have to cut them to size and re-drill the holes in the channel for those. But, you know, at least I'm not having to remake my entire roof rack. So I'm going to give this a go today. I managed to do it in a test piece and it worked okay. So I'm going to try doing it on my actual crossbars, and hopefully if I don't muck any of them up, then I'll be able to keep all of them, as I said, and then just remake the long rails. Right, well there's all the crossbars that I've taken off the roof. Made an absolute mess with the paint getting them off. I'll worry about that later. Alright, so this is my crossbar here with the holes obviously already drilled in it. Now the 2 holes at the ends are where the crossbar attaches to the bracket. So the bracket sits under here and the crossbars bolt down onto it. So on the ends here I need to cut the big holes in the top because the bolts have to go down onto the bottom face. So I need to cut the bigger holes there. But these ones in the middle are for the rails that go this way and they sit on top. So the bolts here actually need to be bolted onto this top face. So for these middle holes, I need to drill the larger hole from the other side. So I just got to make sure when I do each of these crossbars that I'm cutting the big access hole on the right side. And in order to cut the holes, I'm going to use this metal hole saw. It's 30mm size. That's the smallest one I have. I probably only need like a 25mm hole maybe to get the socket in, but this will have to do because I don't have anything smaller. It's still small enough for the width of this 50mm wide RHS. It's not going to compromise the sides at all if I don't get too close to the edge. So I've just got to try and keep the holes as close to the middle as I can. It'll be a bit tricky in some places because this one's not too bad, but on some of the holes are a bit closer to the edge. But anyway, we'll see how we go. It's also going to be a bit tricky to drill the hole with this because, as you can see, I've already got 9mm holes cut here for the bolts to pass through, and that's quite a bit bigger than the width of this pilot drill on my hole saw. So normally when you're drilling a hole with a hole saw, the pilot drill bit kind of does a little hole first, keeps it in position, stops this kind of slipping around as it's going in. I'm not going to have that function, so hopefully it won't slip around too much. I'll just have to be really careful just starting off that it doesn't slip around too much. Anyway, we'll see how we go. Christ, that's not going to work. Okay, well, I'm not sure if you can see this, but that's not going to work because, as I said, without that pilot drill to keep it steady, it's just jumping around all over the place and it's not locking into a nice groove to cut. I tried doing it on the drill press as well, but I just kept having the same issue. And in fact, trying to do it this way just kept jamming the drill press and it wouldn't cut through at all. Well, I mucked around for hours trying to cut those holes in my crossbars and just kept making an absolute mess of it. And in the end, I decided to just ditch it all and start again and remake the whole roof rack using C-channel instead of RHS. So I went and ordered another 6 lengths of aluminium. And this time I got C-channel, which is this stuff here. So you can see, unlike the RHS, which is like a hollow rectangle, it's got 4 sides. The C-channel only has 3 sides. So what you can do then is bolt just through one face of this, and the bolt will just clamp down on whichever face you've got it on, and it won't be crushing the whole piece. So I'm going to start again and make the whole roof rack with this stuff. Hopefully now that I've done it once, it'll be a lot quicker and easier the second time around, because I'm on a pretty tight deadline now. I took time off work to do the trip up to Ellie Beach to get the electrical system installed, and there's only a couple of weeks left now before I have to be back at work, so I need to try and get this done as soon as possible so I can get up there to see my electrician. So second time around, hopefully roof rack 2.0 will be a better version than the last one. Thankfully, building the roof racks the second time around proved to be so much quicker and easier. It helped that because I'd already done it once before, I knew exactly what measurements all the crossbars and all of the rails had to be, so I was able to cut them all to size reasonably quickly without having to remeasure everything. And the C-channel was also a lot easier to file smooth than the RHS was as well, although I have to say filing so many edges was still a lot of hard work. Drilling the holes in the C-channel was really easy too. Because I was only needing to bolt through one face, it didn't matter so much whether or not I had the drill perfectly straight and at 90 degrees because I was only drilling through one side. This meant that I was able to drill all the holes by hand instead of having to set them up on my drill press as I did the first time, so it was much quicker. It only took me a couple of hours work to get all of the crossbars up on the roof, and then it was time to do the long rails. Getting the long rails up onto the roof was easier the second time around as well because the C-channel is a little bit lighter than the RHS and was much easier to manoeuvre when going up the ladder. Once I had the long rails in place, I clamped them down onto the crossbars, and then the trickiest bit was marking exactly where the holes needed to go. I managed to solve this issue by cutting a pencil to a tiny size that would fit inside the C-channel, and then I was able to mark exactly where the holes were so that I knew where to drill. And there it is. The first time around, it took me almost a week to get the roof racks built to this stage, but this time I managed to get the entire roof rack built in just one day. And here you can see what I mean about the bolts. Instead of going through the whole lot, the bolts are now just clamping down onto the two inside faces, and there's no risk of the C-channel crushing. So I changed the way I painted the rails the second time around because I really wasn't happy with the paint on the first roof rack that I built. I mentioned in the last video when I built the first lot of roof racks that when it came to the painting, I used this Rust Guard True Bite primer, which is meant to be fine for aluminium. It's a water-based one and I hadn't used it before. I've only ever painted metal using oil-based paints, usually because I'm painting steel and I've sort of coated it in Penetrol to prevent rust before I paint, and Penetrol is oil-based, so I've always just used oil-based paint on metal, but I thought I'd give this a go because it's water-based and therefore a lot easier to clean up. And as I said, it was supposed to be good for aluminium, but it is rubbish. Seriously, don't use this primer. It just didn't stick to the aluminium properly and it was so easy to scratch it off. The paint, when I painted the enamel on top of this, the enamel stuck to the primer okay, but the primer was just peeling off the aluminium like it was plastic. So it really didn't stick well at all. Absolute waste of time. I made a massive mess of the rails putting them up the first time. Just any little bump would scratch the paint off. So I definitely don't recommend you using the water-based Rust Guard paints. So this time around, I did what I would normally do for metal, and that is I used just the ordinary oil-based metal primer, so Rust Guard metal primer, and I painted 2 coats of the primer. The first coat I actually mixed in with Penetrol, so I did about 50-50, maybe 60-40 primer to Penetrol. Mix that together for the first coat. The idea of that is not because I'm so really worried about the aluminium rusting, because it's not really going to do that, but another good thing about Penetrol is that it helps paint stick. I mean, I think it even says that on the can. Makes paint stick to anything, and it really does. It helps the paint to stick. So I mixed that in with the first coat of primer and it did the job. It stuck really well to the aluminium. Then I did another coat of primer just with 100% primer, so 2 coats of that, and then I finished it off with 2 coats of the Rust Guard epoxy enamel, and again I used the oil-based for the top coat, and it just worked so much better the second time around. Obviously it's a lot messier. You need terps to clean up when you're using oil-based paint, so it's not as easy to work with, but definitely sticks a lot better to the metal, gives a much better finish, and I was much happier with the paint job this time around. I'm using high tensile bolts to bolt all of my roof rack rails together, and the ones that I'm using are zinc plated steel. Now, I know that there are going to be people that don't, no, you should be using stainless steel bolts because they're stronger. Stainless steel bolts are stronger than ordinary steel bolts, but high tensile steel bolts are actually stronger than ordinary stainless steel. High tensile zinc plated steel bolts are more than strong enough for this job, and there's a very good reason why I want to use zinc plated steel and not stainless steel to bolt my roof racks together. And the reason is because I'm trying to minimize the risk of galvanic corrosion. Galvanic corrosion is a type of corrosion that can occur when you've got 2 different metals that are in contact with each other, and those metals are exposed to some sort of conductive solution. So in practical terms, that's a situation where metals are exposed to rain or to salt water from the ocean. Then you can get corrosion in one of those metals occurring faster than it would if it was just one metal alone. Which metal corrodes faster depends on which metals you're using. So if you Google galvanic corrosion, you'll often see an image of what they call the galvanic chart, which is basically a list of metals, and they're listed in order of their potential difference. In this chart, you can see a list of common metals, and they're listed with the least noble metals at the top of the chart and the more noble metals towards the bottom. When galvanic corrosion occurs, electrons are transferred from the least noble to the more noble metals, and it's the least noble metal that will suffer corrosion much faster than if it wasn't in contact with the other metal. Now, the rate at which galvanic corrosion occurs depends on a few things. It depends on the electrolytes that are present in the water that the metals are exposed to. So it occurs to a little bit of an extent with rainwater, but it occurs much more readily in the presence of salt water. So if you're spending a lot of time near the ocean, the bus is getting covered with ocean spray, this is something that you need to consider. And the other big factor that influences how quickly this occurs is how far apart those metals are on this chart. So the greater the potential difference between the two metals, the more likely and the faster galvanic corrosion will occur. So you can see on this chart that aluminium alloys are fairly close to the top, whereas stainless steel is all the way down here at the bottom, and zinc is at the top, pretty close to the aluminium. Now you'll see here that stainless steel exists in two positions on this scale. There's an active version and a passive version. Now stainless steel usually only exists in its active form in very special circumstances. For instance, if you've got pockets of stagnant water where there's no oxygen, then stainless steel can exist in its active form. But most of the time in the real world, it exists in its passive form. And certainly that's the case where we're talking about roof racks on a bus that are exposed to oxygen in the air and flowing water, then the stainless steel is going to be in its passive form. So you can see here that stainless steel is quite away from aluminium on this galvanic scale. So if you were to use stainless steel bolts, then there's a significant chance of this galvanic corrosion occurring, and the aluminium is going to corrode much faster than it would if you didn't use the stainless steel bolts. With zinc plated bolts, on the other hand, because zinc is quite close to aluminium on this scale, you will still get some galvanic corrosion, but it's going to occur to a much lesser degree and much more slowly. And in fact, because zinc is less noble than the aluminium, the corrosion is actually going to occur on the zinc. So the zinc plating on the steel bolt will corrode, which will still leave the steel bolt in place in your aluminium. And in fact, that's why a lot of steel is coated with a zinc plating, because the idea is that the zinc will corrode before the steel, and it just provides an extra level of protection for the steel. So that's why I'm making sure that all of my bolts and all of my washers and all of the nylock lock nuts that I'm using for these roof racks, anything that's going to be in contact with the aluminium, I'm making sure that I'm using zinc plated, just to try and minimize the risk of galvanic corrosion as much as I possibly can. And the other thing that's important to note is that while all the rails that I'm using for my roof racks are made from aluminium, the brackets that attach to the gutters are actually made from steel. And so where the rails are sitting on the brackets, again, you've got this direct contact between aluminium and steel, two different metals, so you can get galvanic corrosion happening here as well. So in order to prevent this, I'm physically separating the two metals using these nylon washers, because the nylon is like a hard plastic, doesn't conduct electricity at all. So it just provides a physical separation between the aluminium and the steel and helps to minimize any corrosion that might occur otherwise. So as I said, I'm using nylock lock nuts on all the bolts in my roof racks, and I'm also using these contact washers, or they're also called safety washers if you're looking at them online. And I don't know if you can see it here. I'll try and give you a close-up. They're specially designed washers that have all these little serrations on them, and in addition to that, they're also very slightly curved, so sort of almost dome shaped. It's very slight, but the idea with these is they're designed to go onto the bolt like that, and as the bolt is tightened, it presses down onto this washer. The washer kind of flattens out, and those little serrations lock into the underneath of the bolt, and it just provides a little bit more protection against vibration and movement and helps to stop that bolt coming loose. So I'm using these underneath the heads of the bolts, and I'm also using them on the opposite side underneath before I put the lock nuts on, because they'll do the same thing. They will sort of grip down onto the top of the lock nut. So using these contact washers in combination with the Nylock lock nuts, even with all the vibration when the bus is driving on the road, these bolts shouldn't come loose. Well, I have just finished tightening the last bolt on Roof Rack 2.0. Whew, it's a big job, and now I've done it twice. I'm much happier with this second version. The channel was so much easier to work with, and I'm happy that it's all, the bolts are all clamped down really well. There shouldn't be any issues with them coming loose. I've used the contact washers and Nylock lock nuts for all of them, so fingers crossed when I start driving the bus nothing will move. It's all super solid at the moment and really tight, so yeah, hopefully. I'm a bit reluctant to say this after what happened last time, but I think I can finally tick this job off the list, and I'm finally ready to get the solar panels installed on the roof.